So hello, this is episode 31 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. So today, mostly what we'll do is we'll talk about wrapping up the first research product, and then we'll talk about moving into the second one. So the first research product, all the sections are complete, at least to the degree of being a manuscript. The only outstanding one is the discussion. So once we fold that in, we can collect these into a complete manuscript, and then talk to the publisher about how they would like to proceed, whether they want to have their own reviewers go over it as a manuscript, or if some other path forward would make sense, just making it public on the site, which has been sort of the its method is to make it public and then fold in any comments that it gets as we go. Is that an option potentially, with doing something like putting the completed manuscript on there, and then having the publisher, announce that or something, such that other interested people might take a look at it, and fold in comments that way, or some hybrid of that where it's just open and public and they have their own reviewers, but then there are also it's also open for external review or whatever. So that, I think, is the next step, is finishing up the discussion section. Then the other sections can be all folded together. And I've experimented a bit with that already in Manifold's platform, and it seems pretty straightforward. And then once we have that up and posted, we can talk to the publisher. Does that sound about right?
That does, yeah. I'm even wondering too if one of those hybrid options is to sort of keep it open for a review period, and then so keep it open for kind of external review, like it's now up, for the next month, I don't know, right, with some deadline, people can put comments and suggestions for revision, and then those are actually, that's a form of a revise and resubmit, and then we incorporate those, and then sort of put it back up, and then it would be fine. Almost like a sort of public review kind of thing. So
that'll be something to ask. I mean, because that's a sort of lingering question, is how fixed the final product will be, right? I mean, there's a different option where, it, in a sense, kind of the review never ends, right? Where because of the way Manifold works, it's like you can set those up there and they just, they can be opened up to comments. And so, theoretically, you could have something that even later someone could comment, and you could determine whether or not to fold that comment in.
yeah.
So it's sort of an open question about how final a research product is, and that's we'll need to get feedback from the publisher about their thoughts. But this is what the conversation should be, right? I mean, we have these kind of options. What would make sense? What would their position be? That kind of thing.
Yeah, and also with the idea that there's going to be subsequent ones. So
right.
Two ways we can take up these comments is some of those comments might be things that we want to address in that manuscript, right? We revise it based on some feedback, or maybe that some of the feedback we get is actually stuff to then be, I could imagine comments we'd get on this first one, they're actually things that we can address better by building them into the second one.
Yeah, that's possible.
And even thinking about, I mean, given the format we're using, how do we build those? I mean, again, sort of thinking about this, our sort of earlier conversation about sort of how do we list various contributors or collaborators.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting if we get feedback on the first product that informs the second. Do those reviews on the first one, do those then become things that we cite in the second one, right? Kind of interesting issue there, where if we're responding to feedback we got on phase 1 and phase 2. How do we sort of, credit the contribution of the first one? Could be.
Yeah, I mean, there is kind of a difference between, sources you're citing and other people who are contributing. That has reared its head before. Some of that might also take on a pragmatic bent. So for example, in the second one, it's going through IRB. You have to control things like, well, who's seeing what, right? Who knows?
Right.
So there may be, I mean, that may not be a serious thing because, you wouldn't necessarily be naming these people as co-authors, and therefore they wouldn't have access to raw data that could be personally identifiable. But it's something to consider.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is the way it is right now. I'll probably kind of reshuffle, as I kind of continually have. We've got these different groups of what Manifold calls texts here. One of them will probably be, products, and these things that are under drafts will be unified. You can put these essentially together into a finished thing. Right now, they're separate sections. For whatever reason, the updated thing doesn't quite work. I'm not sure how to. There's not really a place to change that. There is a publication date, but that's when they're finished. But anyway, these are all current. The results one, as I mentioned, that was a thing to get through, and we'll see about, because like I have questions about how this section in particular is handled because it has so many incorporated visuals.
Yeah.
So some of these, like we have a figure here. Some of these it seems fine, feasible, but because there's so many of them, as you start to get into it, I have direct questions about should some of these, some things are punted out into links, and so I'm wondering, should some of these things, so we get a little bit later here, should some of these be separated out into links rather than embedded visuals? Because you can see it starts to get a little choppy to read just because it's so driven by these visualizations.
Yeah.
It's not atrocious, but just as someone who's been working with this, it does break things up. And a lot of these later visuals are more kind of proof of what's being said. Some of these other ones, it's more like a mechanism in which you're finding stuff. Some of the later ones, it's almost just like, well, see.
Yeah.
So that's something that I have a question about, like in terms of readability. Should some or all of these be pushed to just links rather than embedded visuals?
Yeah. Or if there's even a way that they can do that kind of, they can be arranged as thumbnails and then expanded if people want to get into them.
Yeah, which is easy enough. I mean, right now those are just embedded images. It's straightforward enough just to make those smaller and indicate that they can be clicked to expand. Because right now these, they're not links; they're just embedded visuals, but they are embedded on the Manifold site. These aren't pointing to something else, so it's easy enough to reduce these, and then you could have them clickable. There's different options there, but that's something we'll need to ask about.
Yeah, that'll be a review stage thing.
Yeah. So that's the gist of that, but that I think is the next step, is finishing the discussion. And where are you with that?
So I think I've got my head around it. So I think sort of setting up sort of trying to highlight what we found and sort of this angle of what we were potentially sort of not sort of surprised by, right? This notion that we had potentially thought that we would get across all of these hits, we'd get a sense of how mechanical Turks is defining the human. And what we really found is that it's there's not a kind of coherence across them, that really what we're finding is particular articulations within the hits as opposed to across the hits, right? This idea that we sort of, right, there's a kind of essentialist notion that's here, and then mechanical Turks would offer its own alternative. And what we're instead finding is that it really varies from intelligence task to intelligence task. And so that's the kind of setup. And then using the stuff on readability and then the stuff on trauma as kind of examples of this sort of entanglement, sort of depending on what the task is attempting to do, it changes what, right, it changes what's human about intelligence and judgment.
Okay.
And then in part, I'm using the language that's ended up being helpful in part because of just sort of spinning off on Amazon's use of the term task. Is the anthropologist Tim Ingold writes about tasks and the taskscape, which is a useful sort of anthropological, part of his argument is sort of somewhat analogous, which is that the sort of skills we take as unique to the human or anything are always a function of particular tasks, right? They don't exist prior to those tasks, but they exist through it. And that oftentimes those tasks are part of larger taskscapes. And so that's useful for parsing we see these hits. And one of the ways that you kind of have to make sense of those hits is to get a sense of that, what's this human intelligence task? What larger taskscape is it a part of? And then that then gives us a sense of how the human is being enrolled each time within that, right? This is we're engaged in this larger set of tasks, and here's a particular set of tasks that we need accomplished. And so here is then what the human is needed for within that task.
Yeah. And so we've got some notes here. Pragmatically, when are you thinking you'll have the draft of that?
Early next week.
Okay. Yeah, I've got the notes here. Okay, and then I can fold all those together. And we briefly talked about, right now it's in APA, but we'll see. I mean, the good news is I've been using Zotero, so it's not too difficult to switch everything over if needs be to a different citation system. You know, one of the big advantages of a citation manager. Only caveat is I haven't been embedding the citations as or through Zotero. It collects all the sources together so you can spit out a bibliography easy enough. But because of the way this is being generated, I didn't embed the citations as or through Zotero, which you can do because then when you flip citation systems, it automatically updates them. Although there's always wrinkles because, you know, APA, for example, uses kind of a two-part where you reference the year right after the author's name, but then if you're going to reference a page number or a paragraph or something, it appears later after the actual appearance. So, you know, it's a two-part citation, which you can't really, you know, it always requires some additional labor. You don't use Zotero, do you?
I did, and then stopped. I should, but
I only bring it up because, you know, you can set up group libraries through Zotero where they're shared and then just synced online.
that's right. I did it for a project when I was collaborating with the psychologist, and he'd been using Zotero, and we used that. But it's been about 7 or 8 years.
Yeah. Well, and that's, you know, where it kind of makes well, there's a lot of advantages, but, you know, one of its things is those kinds of groups. So when you're doing, you know, shared labor at a distance, it facilitates that by allowing you to do those shared libraries that can be reconciled.
Yeah. Well, it was useful for us too, because we were oftentimes working across citation styles. So
Right.
it was a way to both just collect those readings, but then also we could just tell it, we could tell Zotero, which depending on where we decided to eventually send it, what we would need those in. So it was also useful for that, because he was largely working in APA and I was, most of the sources I was uploading were MLA. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's, I mean, I teach to my students now, I have a short list of, if you get nothing else out of this class, there are a couple of things, awareness of audience context and purpose, know how to get sources and how to find sources. And now I've worked in use a citation manager just because it's such a, it's such an advantage. And I mean, of course, we sort of predate the prevalence of citation managers, but it's such a useful tool, particularly, yeah, I mean, if you submit something somewhere and then, it gets rejected or whatever, and then so you have to go somewhere else. If you have a huge, volume of sources where you're getting into the triple digits, it's like, I can't manually tweak every one of these without the chance for monstrous human error and
oh yeah,
the labor waste. And yeah,
I had to recently convert something into Chicago, and
yeah,
I just put it off, and then I just woke up one morning saying, okay, I just got to do this. I wish I'd have done something. I wish mistakes were made, in other words.
yeah. Lots of
Um,
to consider um, up front. All right.
okay.
Well, anywho, so that'll, hopefully we can get that then, that product solidified. As soon as yours comes in, we can get the manuscript up, and then what is this, September, talk to the publisher, and then move forward with that.
Yeah.
So the next one, which, I was curious about, did it make sense to have a pause, but then I'm not exactly sure what we would be doing. And also, there's a kind of synthesis moving from one to the other, or one to the other. So I was thinking about the next product, which, as we've discussed, throughout, probably since this first one is dealing with the platform, I mean, one thing in the product is it talks about that we are attempting to kind of align with the platform as a whole. And that's why the method of text mining makes sense, right? I mean, that's something, even though we kind of had to reconcile, some folks had mentioned, things like data collection, right? So if you're collecting data in this way, you're getting a lot of these abnormal hits, abnormal in the sense of Turkers don't do them, which, of course, underscores when we talk about things like abnormality, that's subjective, right? Just like when we talk about things like error or failure, or broken, those are subjective statements, not objective statements. There is no concept of broken. It's not doing what you want it to do. Well, in another perspective, it's doing only what it can, right? Those are, error and brokenness are solely human concepts. A thing with me. We were aligning with the perspective of the platform, and that's why the method made sense. And this was leading to a notion of the second product would take what was learned in the first product in terms of what the text mining showed, and then potentially shift that to more of a focus on the Turkers, right? Let me go ahead and, sorry, I've got too many windows open here. Corresponding to that would be a method that is suitable, right? So, we were talking about things that shifted from the world of text mining more into the area of kind of social science, where, either doing some surveying of Turkers themselves, or as we talked about, looking at, and the way we would do that would be through hits themselves. I mean, that's something that came out, was we want to post some hits and deal with it in those terms. So posting hits that are straight up, surveys or those kind of things about Turk or experience. That's one way to go. We talked about posting other kinds of hits. So instead of necessarily just, here's a hit that is asking your perspective on hits or whatever in a kind of meta level. But here are some hits that are asking you to do stuff, and then from that we can gain information.
Right.
Now there is, as it says here, there are ethical guidelines. They're a little bit older, but I don't think anything in them is outdated. There are from one of the third parties, Turk Opticon, which we have looked at. It provides guidelines for academic requesters. So a lot of this thing's whole thing was that, Mechanical Turk is, as we know, and it has been used a lot for academic research. And that's kind of there's an ambivalence about that, in that, not only academics using it, and there are some questions about, just sort of fidelity of response. Is it the response you get comparable to, what you would get out of a big section of Psych 101 or something like that? That's one thing. But on the other side of this, as we can see here, there are questions about, the potential for abuse, or the lack, I suppose, of a kind of, as we see here, a guideline or a body that acknowledges that to post these kinds of things affects the platform as a whole. So, as has been sort of pointed out, and you can think of this as a kind of Heisenberg, to observe is to change, right? So the ways that academics examine Mechanical Turk, and the ways that they use hits, those have an effect, and the research itself has an effect on the whole. And so, we've talked with folks about that, and it shouldn't be a big surprise that, to post these things changes the nature of the platform. The published work characterizes the platform in certain ways that can have effects. So folks have talked to us about that kind of thing. And then also, just sort of the level of, not everything that academics have done has gone through IRB. So there are things like, and of course, not everything on the platform is academic, but gets at the same kind of stuff. That's one of the things we saw on the text mining product was, there were a lot of hits that were, for example, asking people about their experience as cancer survivors, or, people who have alcohol or substance abuse problems. And not all of those were academic studies. And so not all of them fell under the aegis of IRB. Right? Some of them said, this falls under disapproval, to give you an IRB number is this study. And so, but others, I don't think came from academic requesters, and were just sort of, polls of personal information. Mm-hmm. And we've seen, articles about this, right? I mean, the one we keep talking about was the one about a person kind of discussing getting paid, in cents, right? So not a whole lot of money to answer survey questions about traumatic things. Right? I mean, right. The glib statement was, I was paid, 50 cents to relive my worst day or whatever.
Yeah.
And as some folks have pointed out to us, it's like that characterization of Mechanical Turk as, a tool of victimization has effects on the platform. Right? It casts it in a certain way. To me, it's similar to work you and I have done before with like Wikipedia, right? I mean, think of the reception of Wikipedia. In a lot of ways, it gets cast negatively because of its academic reception, right? I mean, the sort of tacit statement is, oh, well, anybody can change it, so therefore it's garbage.
Right.
Which, is, once you look at it, that's a big a reduction of, what it really is. It obviously has those kinds of issues, and it has other issues which are much more beyond Wikipedia. For example, it has a cast of editors. It kind of gets it coming and going, where people are like, oh, anybody can change it, therefore it's bad. If you look at it closely, it's like, well, no, there's sort of a special cast of editors who actually control it, and that's why it's bad, right? It gets it coming and going. It's too democratic and it's anti-democratic.
Right, right, right.
But if you look at Wikipedia as a thing, it's marvelous in a lot of ways. I mean, it's full of interesting stuff. In a lot of ways, it's no worse, depending on what you call worse, than any other encyclopedia. It's highly subjective, like every other encyclopedia that's ever existed. Yes.
The headlines, there'd always be sort of a news, at least early on when these things were getting written, right, about the mistakes that were found in Wikipedia. But I love that the headline was never mistake found within 30 seconds of being online and immediately corrected, right? The story was always, we found a mistake in Wikipedia. Sort of like, yeah, that's in part its model, right? That mistake was found very quickly. Like it was weird, like you could have written a headline, mistake in encyclopedia, and immediately corrected.
Comparable headline, mistake found in Encyclopedia Britannica lasts forever.
Right. Never goes away.
I mean, go back a few decades into published encyclopedias and see how they're framing things. One of my favorite examples is the way they talk about human groups.
Yeah.
And they're, literally the language being used about particular groups of human, savages. It's like, well, that's going to last for 300 years now,
Wasn't ugly a term that was used for one? I remember.
Yeah. And I mean, we can look back at it and say, oh, that's pretty biased language. Like, yeah, we haven't escaped that. We're still doing it unavoidably for all time.
Yes.
And so, the point is, studies themselves change the nature of the things that are being studied. This has been brought to our attention, and I don't think it's any big surprise, but you always need, there's one thing to say, well, that's just blanketly true, and we kind of think of this as rhetoricians. It's like, well, yes, of course there's subjectivities, but it's like, yeah, but what's the subjectivity here, right? Then that's always going to be a situated, unique thing. And so it's useful to look at these kinds of things like these guidelines. And as I said, they're a few years out of date. It's 6 years, which, it feels like dog years on the internet, but, that's only 6 years ago. And I don't think anything's changed here. This is this kind of project to articulate these guidelines. And so I think if nothing else, it's like, it's useful to point to these kind of things. If we're going to do this, right, it's going to have to go through IRB because we are dealing with humans, ostensibly, if not exclusively.
Right.
And so it is useful to kind of have these as guidelines and even to point to them. It's like, well, we're adhering to these. And a lot of these, it's not like it's a big deal. It's a lot of it's sort of like, fair pay. And this is something that's interesting, is like, don't tinker, don't be duplicitous. But also, like, this isn't a place to experiment. Like, I'm going to go in there and say a lot of things that are not true in a third party forum and see what happens. In the same way, it's like, don't go into a discourse community and lie to everyone just to see what fights pop up. It's like a lot of these guidelines, it's like, yeah, that makes good sense, where it's like, don't mess with people just to see what happens when you mess with them.
Right.
And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And some of this also, it's like, well, probably some of this would be caught by IRB anyway, where it's like, well, you can't just mess with people, right? I mean, you can't even now. There are protections. Well, I mean, it has to go through IRB, where there are protections, or it's like, can you lie to people? Like, what if you want to do a psych experiment where you tell them you're doing this, but what you're actually doing is seeing, are they going to eat the marshmallow or not, right? So, to what degree can you do that? And in cases, of course, you can, but as, I think Amy was talking to us about, that's the role of the board, is to negotiate that kind of risk about how damaging is it if you tell people this is a quiz, but what you're actually doing is seeing how long it takes them, or what happens when you turn up the or turn down the air conditioning and see how they perform when it's sweltering. I mean, there are
Right.
things like that, but risk is mitigated. It's like, well, that's not a big deal versus no, this is a big deal. It's like when you start getting into things like, placebo studies and stuff, nothing we're doing, but
Right.
like a real risk category here.
Yeah.
So these are here, they're important, and I think we'll return to these kind of things. But as we've been wrapping up, this first product, we've been thinking about, so what is the second thing gonna be? And tied to that is method. How you gonna do it? So I've been thinking about this, and I had a few ideas about what this is gonna be. And okay, so one option is just to straight up have hits that ask Turkers about their experience on Mechanical Turk, right? I mean, just sort of one straightforward thing is, here's what we see about the human and the non-human based on this previous one, and straight up, confirm or deny. I mean, what do you think about this? Or, and I'm not sure exactly how we'd get at that, but, I think we'd probably want to have a few questions. And then, do you want an open-ended kind of question where you ask somebody to respond, or do you want like a survey kind of question? And there's a trade-off there in terms of, the number of people you can handle. If you're doing like a survey thing, the more the merrier. Get more Likert scales, who cares? It's all numbers. Versus if you're getting something discursive, you're going to want to have fewer. It's probably going to be compensated a little bit higher. That's another thing. It's like, unless we get grant funding for this, it's coming out of pocket. So that's something to consider as well. But then, if you get a discursive thing, how are you going to process that? And we talked with, I think it was Scott, about this one. Do you remember where he was talking about, well, we needed, because they were doing like straight up content analysis where it's like, well, we needed to train coders, right? And then coders were going to say, well, it's this kind of thing or that kind of thing. I can't quite remember the particulars, but we could go back to the video. So, I mean, that's one category of thing is just straight up ask folks and see what you get.
Yeah.
And then there are particulars of that is like, well, if you want to talk to folks and you want to do it discursively, does it make sense to do it textually, or does it make sense to do it, have them record speech? Because then not only do you get a different kind of answer versus one that somebody types up, but there is also a kind of de facto check on, are you actually getting a human versus a bot? It's probably harder for a bot to synthesize speech believably than it is for a bot to synthesize text, which is actually getting, pretty, they're doing that pretty well. So that's one thing, is just like, straight up ask them about it. But that's not the only option here. So for example, like, are you familiar with, and this relates to what I just said, are you familiar with GPT-3? I think you're muted because I'm not hearing anything.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
What's that?
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. So GPT-3, generative pre-trained transformer. It's, the takeaway from this is it's something that you can give a certain amount of text, and then it can compose text based on what you've given it. Mm. And so there's API access to this, although it's in private beta. And they're right now kind of giving people access to it to see what all they can do. And there's some really interesting developments of this. The ones you see, like when you search for this, it'll say like, this article written by a machine, right? So, and there's already sort of, and this was just, I think, yesterday, backlash about, because the Guardian gave some text to GPT-3 while they ran it through the API. And then it generated an article, and then they said what they did, because they, of course, had to do some editorial stuff in terms of combining fragments together and this sort of thing. And then there was immediately kind of, here's what are the issues with what they did. But they're seeing a lot of other deployments. One of the ones that I think is kind of most interesting is, let me see, GPT-3. What was the? there's a kind of like a game called AI Dungeon. I may have sent you a link to this months ago. I don't know.
This one
But
yeah,
what's that?
this one I think rings a bell.
So, I mean, the way to think of this is it's kind of like Dungeons and Dragons, but played by yourself with a machine as the DM. So, it'll ask for like, what kind of scenario do you want, like a fantasy one or a sci-fi one or like a detective story. And then it'll give you like a little bit of a scenario, like, you find yourself walking on a pathway between villages and you have a sword at your hip and you've done this. And then you basically just tell it. It's like collaborative storytelling where you say like, well, I'm haunted by the memory of my murdered family. And so I'm going to the town to seek revenge. And you know, it'll do a pretty good job keeping up with you. It'll say like, you remember that day faithfully. You were out in the field and the soldiers came in, and so you're going to this. I mean, it does a pretty good job. Where if you follow this kind of stuff, when you look at it, you're like, damn, it does a good job because you're aware of previous ones. There's such a big chasm in a way between this one and one's even GPT-2, which was less adept at this, still pretty good, but it'd still be, the illusion would break. In
Right.
GPT-3, you can still tell, but if you're sensitive to this, it's like, boy, this is pretty good at this. It's just like, it's a lot better. It's not human, it's not like it's Turing, like, it's still not where, you're completely fooled, but it just feels so much better. Now, if you're not familiar with these and you're just like a person, you will notice, you'll just slip right in the uncanny valley where it's like, particularly if you try and itch at it, where you start saying things that are, grammatical, but if it tells you you're walking on the road and you got a sword at your hip and you say, and it's the far flung future, and I take the hamster out of my pocket and I dress it in doll's clothes, and something that's just completely disconnected. If you itch at it, you can in places start to see, and it's like, well, I can tell this isn't a person. So
Right.
it's kind of a question of perspective. It's like, are you coming from a human talking to other humans, or are you coming from someone who has a little background in this? And it's like you can tell, man, this thing is a lot different.
Yeah. Plus, you can probably just tell that if you play it for 5 minutes and it doesn't yell a racial slur at you, it's probably not a human.
Yeah. Well, you're not on a online service. I mean, there's some of it where it is sort of like a Turing test kind of thing, where it's like, is this a machine talking to me, or have I been mechanical Turked? Where what's really happened is it's connected to somebody who's getting compensated to talk with me, right?
Always the fear.
Well, and I mean, that kind of gets trotted out when they do sort of Turing test sort of things through chat bots, where it's like, can you tell if you're talking to a chat bot or to just a person? And I mean, as you kind of glibly point out, oftentimes that's what people do is they start skewing into, insults or sexual content to try and suss out, is this a human being or is this a bot or whatever?
Yeah.
Anywho, all this is interesting, but it's a
Well,
maybe.
but it does go back to, I mean, I remember that, I mean, the whole sort of chess playing automaton, there's that moment when I think it's Kasparov was playing Deep Blue, and Deep Blue did something, and it was
Yeah.
at that moment he goes, no, there's a person. Like he basically he cried mechanical Turk, like that computer just did something that Kasparov couldn't help but attribute to a human being, right? That in that moment he basically accused the IBM people of running a mechanical Turk on him.
Well, and I think, and let's see, that's in what's Sharples or Sharpless. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but it's his book about. It's kind of neat. It's sort of about the Gothic and the chess playing robot. I mean, it's a book. Let me just pull it
Yeah.
up for goodness sake. Yeah, a cultural history of chess players, minds, machines, and monsters. I mean, this book is just so squarely up my alley. It's not even
Minds, Machines, and Monsters is sometimes how I've introduced you.
yeah. I should sue. Um, for the subtitle, not for your use. But anyway, yeah, I mean, and I think, I mean, I may be misremembering this, but I think what the issue was, it's not that it was so good that he thought it was a human, it's that it was doing aberrant things, right? I mean, that's kind of like, with the original chess Turk, it's like, it's not that it's so good, it's like if it made a mistake in a way that seemed human, if it was duped, or if it played in a way that was creative in a way you couldn't anticipate, or if it showed some form of peak or emotion, it's like, oh, okay, well, then that's got to be a human because it's not playing in the mechanized way that I want it to.
Yeah.
But so anywho, the takeaway from this is is this. So OpenAI API, they're allowing you to submit for beta access, right, where it has request access. I did this, and I think I'm on the wait list, but I don't have access to it. That's the takeaway. So what I wanted to do was this. I wanted to get access to this API so that maybe we could scratch at this by doing something like have us write a hit and then have GPT-3 write, similar hits, and
Right.
see how the responses were different, right? And I think that's something that wouldn't run afoul of these guidelines or IRB. The catch is you'd have to have those things written in advance. It's not like you can tell IRB, here's what we want to do, and they're like, sure, go ahead. They want to see your material.
Right.
So I think that's something that would have gotten through and wouldn't run afoul of these guidelines because, we wouldn't be experimenting on people in that way. It's just, we'd be having this thing in a sense, it's kind of like, it's what's going on already, where it's like, we're using the machine or the machine, we're in partnership with the machine to accomplish a task, write up a understandable, prompt for people to follow. So that was an idea. The problem is we don't have access to it. I think I'm maybe on the wait list, but I don't have access to it. So that one.
Don't they know who you are?
Maybe they do, and that's why. I don't know.
That's about
I'm assuming what's happened, although I don't know. I'm assuming what's happened is this thing's gotten a lot of traction, and so they're probably just like inundated. And they're also considering things like, and I don't want to put words in this organization's mouth, but I think they are considering like, do we need to monetize this? Because, it did get a lot of traction. And if you're doing like API calls to something they're hosting, for example, that's not free,
Yeah.
Even if you're just paying for things like bandwidth. So yeah, see, why did OpenAI decide to release a commercial product? We care most is ensuring, blah, blah, blah. So that there are some material realities here of just, doing this. So right. I'm assuming they've got more than enough stuff, more than enough applications. And, what I outlined us doing with it just, didn't barge its way to the top of that list or whatever. So it's something to consider, but it's just not a feasible option right now.
Yeah.
But, it's also just kind of thinking about what do we want to do here? So, one option is just straight up, asking Turkers, hey, what do you think about this? Or can you confirm this or that or whatever? And I think that is a straightforward way to go. There was a part of me, though, that I was like, I'm not sure it's my first choice at this juncture. And in part, it's like, well, one, it's, I wonder if that's already been done. It wouldn't surprise me if, in some of that economic research that exists or, some of the psych-soc or something, if some of this hasn't already been done where it's just like, well, what do you guys think about this?
Even journalistically, it's been done. Just sort of interviews with, the kind of the Amazon paid me 50 cents to talk about my most, that's, that's a journalist interviewing somebody about their experience on the service. So that, I wonder if, because part of what I was thinking about too is not just how we would, my other question too is going forward, particularly and what triggered it for me was just going back through, you had up our list of credits And I was thinking like, who would be what might be another round of people we'd want to bring on to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if there are people that are out there that we could do some digging into that do sort of interesting ethnographic work.
Yeah.
And like, like we don't want to just do, I mean, it may be able that what we're told is, well, you're going to have to do interviews with people. That's just whether it's been done before or not,
Right.
that's just part of your due diligence. But I wonder if there are people that are doing, I don't know, interesting ethnographic work that would be able to sort of, particularly people that are doing, digital ethnography.
Yeah.
Know that we talked a little bit when we talked to Jim Brown
Jim,
about
and well, he directed us to some folks, right?
So I wonder if that's potentially a route to go down is people that are doing interesting and creative ethnographic work that's built. I mean, I think one of our interests, and I think what you just laid out speaks to that, is one of the reasons we don't just want to talk to people is we want part of this whole Mechanical Turks project to be a sort of a constant iterative work of collaborating with machines in some way, right? So the idea of just interviewing people seems to part of potentially why that's not your first choice is it's missing that other, right? That part of, in other words, for the first phase, we didn't just choose computational rhetoric because we thought that was the best tool. We thought it was also a kind of interesting meta move to use computational rhetoric to get at, right, that our choice of method was resonant with the thing that we were engaging, right, that we wanted. So, and hence one of the reasons that we wanted to potentially generate hits as a way of doing qualitative research is we want more of those partnerships in this phase as well, right? So there are people that are doing ethnographies that are attending more directly to the digital tools they're using to do that ethnography, so that the tools themselves are in part, principal investigators, or they're enrolled in some more integrative way.
Yeah. Well, and another, I mean, a related thing is, so I mean, if our focus is that the sort of blurred gray area between the human and the non-human, I mean, in this case, largely the digital machine or the algorithm or whatever, and they're, getting at that in that kind of format, right? I mean, if that's where our focus is, because it's not really just a broad question of, so what do you think about this, right? Do you know what I mean? It's
Right.
not, or how are you doing? It's not really quite that. It's, so it would get at issues like, potentially, what do you think you do that can't be automated? It's that kind of thing where it's like, how are you not a machine in this, right? I mean, it's kind of itching at those kinds of questions and attending to sort of our focus. And another thing is, we're not ethnographers. So, I mean, you're right. To do that kind of work, it's sort of like, yeah, but what are we in this, right? And because what I don't exactly want to be is like a poor version of something else. I mean, yeah, I guess I'm always kind of that.
Yeah.
But it's like I don't want to just, it's novel because I'm doing it badly, but anywho, so I mean, you're right. There's an avenue for that. The way I kind of in my notes, I had those three avenues where, and I didn't frame it this way, but I mean, I think you're exactly right. This kind of notion of ethnographic work or identity formation work, and we do have a pathway into that through some of those folks that, I think Jim mentioned, some folks who potentially could help with that.
Yeah. I know one person, because I assigned some of her pieces. Her name is Sarah Pink, and she's got a book on digital ethnography that I might check out. She also, I didn't have my students read that. She also does stuff on sensory ethnography, and that's what my students were looking at. And that's someone that Casey Boyle put me on to. But she's got a book on, I think it's even like a textbook on digital ethnography. And that might be something to look at.
Yeah. So that's one of the pathways. The GPT that was another pathway. And then a third pathway, and this is the one that I thought maybe might be the most productive, but I'm willing to be persuaded. Um, so one of the things that popped out from the first product was this concept of readability that became kind of a master concept at different points because it spoke to the sort of bidirectionality. It also spoke to the fusion of the intellectual and the bodily, right? That, I mean, when it says readable, in a lot of ways, it means, can you suss out, it speaks to legibility, but also comprehension, right? So I thought readable might be an interesting thing to focus on with Turks. And so I was like, well, how do we kind of address that? And I thought there are some ways maybe to interrogate that question of readability, even just things like, if we got a range of something like stock photos and then introduced something like an emotional concept, right? I mean, or even just a term. Which of these stock photos do you associate with X? And, we don't even have to have a right answer. We just would see, like, do Turkers, where's the split? Do they spray it all over? Or is it like, well, this image is consistently this thing? And so maybe that's a way at scratching at that, or have them do something like select the most readable summary of a passage, or even generate, a readable summary of a passage, or something like, give them different photos of things and have them pull some form of information out of it. So maybe not just like, here's a photo of a receipt or whatever, but something that's like that speaks to both your capacities as a visual sensor, but also your cognitive, pull information out of this.
Yeah.
Those kinds of questions to try and scratch at this concept of readability. And potentially, if we went that route, the explanatory framework might be the one that we've talked about previously as readability functioning both as something humans do on symbol systems, right? We read symbol systems, but also humans being symbols to be decrypted, humans as readable things, right? I mean, that's something that a little bit popped out in the text mining piece, that, partially when we say readable, it's, as I think kind of Casey alludes to, it's, the human behavior as predictable and meaningful in certain ways or whatever. So it would put us potentially in an explanatory framework of legibility. So, reaching back into the kind of lineage of literacy, right? The orality and its base unit of the word, or even the phoneme or whatever, the base unit, the base semantic unit, into literacy and its base unit of the printed text, right? And then even, the grapheme or whatever, whatever your atom is, and then into the digital space where we're kind of fumbling with what is the base unit of, if digitality is something other than orality or literacy, what is it? What is its base unit? And, it's not clear we've really got a consensus on that. And, something I've floated previously is, if we consider that move to shift the node of processing, right? If we look at it as a system and we see in orality and literacy, you still have the human as the processing unit, right? It is decrypting the symbol, be it spoken or written. If in digitality, you shift that to where the human is the symbol to be processed by a broader cognitive network of non-humans, or principally non-humans, then, it's literacy is, so how is the machine reading us?
Yeah.
So I think then it puts us in that lineage of, Ong and Ulmer's electracity. That's Ulmer, I think, right?
Yeah, I think so. That sounds right.
And potentially into folks like Casey and other folks looking at, humans as sensors, but also as those that are sensed.
Yeah. No, it's in part, we got a little bit of that as we're starting in this last piece, right, that the sort of the play with the preposition, right, the human being either as a sensor of or as a sensor for, kind of gets at that, right? There's some of those tasks that we need the human being as a sensor for something else, right? So I'm essentially people using humans as, microscopes and,
Right.
that thing as an instrument. But then also, right, as you're pointing out, then also sensor, they're also kind of that the data that's being mined is from the human itself, right? Its senses are what's being collected as opposed to employed.
Yeah, and arguably you can see that um, the emphasis on product, right, and product discrimination, our ability to do that. Even the trauma stuff, we're good because we're subject to that. So that was the third pathway that I was considering is, and I'm not completely clear about what the hits would be, but hits that are scratching at the concept of readability in some way, and how that might then have an interpretive frame. I mean, part of the reason why I was kind of interested in it is because the interpretive framework kind of popped up to me. We could put it in that lineage of literacy, but then how literacy has changed if no longer the emphasis is you as a literate human, but the system as literate, understanding what it is you do, right? That it's human literacy.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what's interesting about the term legible, right? That it's less about the literacy of the human and more about how legible the human is,
Right.
which is kind of, I mean, again, it's just a repetition of what you said, right? That the literacy now is less a function of you being able to do something and more of being able to make yourself legible, right? That's potentially what marks the orality to literacy to digital literacy or
Yeah.
electric,
Whatever's post.
right? It's your capacity to be read, to render
Mhm.
your legible. And it seems like that's a lot of Turks, a lot of the hits are getting at that in some way. Either make yourself legible in terms of describe to us your trauma or your feelings about these brands, but also the human being's capacity with readability to generate text that can then be legible to a machine.
Yeah.
Okay, so not just rendering ourselves legible, but also generating legibility.
Yeah.
Human beings are both legible products and processes that generate other legible products.
Expose other. Yeah. It's
Right.
as though it's as, sorry, go ahead.
No, so a lot of those hits are like, again, render your trauma legible, but also render this receipt legible.
Right. I mean, it's as though the commodity is information, and we are, miners pulling that out of the environment around us. And there's that who is it? Ah, God bless. Who is it who talks about this notion of full transparency being an obscenity? Gosh, I can't remember. I have it in Zotero, but I can't remember who says this. But it's this notion of it seems like now the goal is to make everything transparent and therefore trackable. I mean, that's the way we talk about this, right? Everyone's got the sort of colloquial horror stories of I was doing this and all of a sudden I started getting ads from Target, right? Target knew I was pregnant before my parents did or whatever, right? There's a kind of colloquial notion of the ambivalence of everything being exposed to the light of comprehensibility, right? Making everything legible or making everything knowable. And so I think, yeah, that's why this one appealed to me is if we drill into the concept, and it's, why is this rhetoric? Because what we're doing is explicating readability, right? If we just straight up drill straight forward into that, what are we talking about now when we say readability? And that's super, super complicated. I mean, it dips into, just straight up, is this a document that is legible, but it scales up into is human behavior trackable, and if there's some way to compose hits that in some way scratch at that multiple meaning, that might be a way to go forward.
Well, and that, I mean, I really I like that because also, just if we're thinking about this sequence of phases
Yeah.
has the nice benefit of A, doing more into this qualitative potentially or direction, but it also more closely follows on the heels of the first one, right? That readability then becomes
What we're going to look at.
something that we in many ways, right? Because it's sort of perfectly reasonable, right? That readability really showed up to us as, boy, this is really creating it's making it difficult to parse the human or the not, right? That we'd find this clean distinction in Turks that was different from a maybe a common sense humanistic framework, but it would be another one that would
Right.
be, but and what we're finding as well that what we're finding is these hits just become these tangle, right? They, as perhaps, they are themselves mechanical Turks, where it's difficult to parse where, that cabinet closes, what's the human doing and what's the machine doing. And that's hard to parse because, right, the human being is potentially in charge because it's playing chess, but it needs a series of mechanisms by which it's able to then move the pieces, right? The human being is playing chess, but it needs the I forget what that's called. The anyway,
I don't know.
yeah, and then but it also needs magnets so it knows where the pieces are, right? That that it's that's the cabinet in which the human and non-human agency become tangled and hard to parse. And readability is one of the things that jumped out to us. So I think it makes sense to then kind of, well, now we want to drill down into readability and get at that from a Turker's perspective. And one of the ways we can get at the Turker's perspective, and this is where that GPT-3 might become useful, right, is it can help us generate legible or illegible hits.
Yeah,
where
that was the hope. Unfortunately, that pathway.
that may fall through, but there may be other ways that we can go about doing that. But I like, so it gives us a focus for this
Right.
second, because ethnographically it could be huge and wide open. So readability gives us a focal point, but it's also a focal point that nicely links that second product to the first one. That in many ways we're doing something iterative, right? It's in that sense we want each piece to being deploying its own kind of method, right? Sort of quantitative computational rhetorics, qualitative ethnographic, and then theoretical, right? But it would be nice if we were taking readability, which emerged from our first method, and now we're going to run it through a second method and see what purchase we get on it.
Which is what prompted it. I mean, it's not like I had this in advance about, okay, well, now here's what we're going to do for this. It's
Yeah.
precisely because, as I'm writing up the results and putting in all the visualizations, it's one of the sort of takeaways was the weirdness of that as a concept and how it enfolded these things that often we set discreetly,
Right.
that started to become ambiguated. Something else that was kind of on my mind was, understandably, the first product, I thought one of its, it's not a problem, it's just one of its features was that it was a little sprawling. I mean, if you look at it if you hold it back, it's like, holy cow, because, like if you look at the results, it goes through sort of three main moves, right? Where it does like an overarching thing, it breaks them into compensation tiers, and then it zooms into particular terms, a handful of particular terms. And it's like from the outside, it's like, boy, that's a lot of ground to cover. And then if you remember, like early on, we were viewing it as that only being a component. I mean, if you remember, like the original sort of outline was one big product that folded in all of this stuff, right? I mean, you remember it was Amy who originally was like, well, you got to parse this out if for nothing else than pragmatic reasons of if you're talking to Turkers, you're going to have to go through IRB because you're dealing with humans.
Right.
And I mean, that also sort of pointed out to us just conceptually, it was just a huge tangle of a lot of stuff. So one thing that was kind of on my shoulder was this first product covers a lot of ground. I mean, even though we try and focus it in, it's like it's long and it covers a lot of ground. And so part of this, I was like, for this second product, I want to make it sort of more manageable and feasible. I think the scope was too big on the first one because we were starting from this huge, we went from what the project was going to be into this product. And so there was, I mean, you can kind of still feel us bucking against it where it's like, well, is this product, or is this for a theoretical product, that's 2 moves away? And so the scope of it was something that was sitting on my shoulders. Like, well, this second product, we need to more consciously think of making it manageable and feasible. So
Right.
it doesn't just, and it's, I mean, it's also a problem I think we both have, is things tend to start spilling over the banks. And it's like, which, it's not a flaw. It's just, okay, well, so, but you do have to figure out, so what are you going to do? Are you going to draw the circle around here or around here? And I think understandably the first product, it was tough to get, just sort of a small circle on it. And so this second one, I was like, think practically about, okay, focus on, a limited scope, something like, this term and what it means. And then also you're going to need to get your arms around, like, just quite literally, what are the hits that you would post that would scratch at this, particularly because those are going to have to go through IRB approval. It's like, well, here's what we're going to ask them. And,
Right.
Anywho, so I was considering that. So as I said, I mean, there are different ways to go here. And I've been thinking about this. I mean, it's kind of putting you on the spot to, say, what are your thoughts about this? Because I was already kind of considering this for the last week. So.
No, I think it's got a lot of, I was about to say it's got legs, and then I said it's got a lot of legs as opposed to it's got legs. But no, I think it both sort of logistically or practically, right, just helps us focus this.
Yeah.
But I also think it really works well as we start seeing about sort of the long-term scope or trajectory of this full thing is. And then, as you said too, as we sort of were talking about early on, right, readability also firmly helps us more firmly ground it for an audience in rhetoric.
Yeah.
I think in large part, right, our bigger scope is this whole question of the human as it bears upon our understanding of rhetoric, and the human itself as a rhetorical concept.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think is potentially purchase enough for the field, but it may be that readability is an additional way in for folks, so that the project sort of takes on this dimension about being about readability, and resonant in that is potentially this sort of post-human or cultural techniques discussion. But readability is makes the project potentially have a broader appeal, but it's also a way of potentially introducing people that are interested in readability and its various rhetorical connotations, right, of introducing them to this other part of the project as well. So I think it might bring people on board who might not otherwise have been on board, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think we had some general notes on this in the overview document. I mean, I'll have to go back through it, but on that concept. Anywho, well, yeah. So I mean, those are things to think about as we move forward. What I might try and do is, I mean, once I get your stuff for the first product, I'll fold that in as quick as I can and get that posted as a complete manuscript. But I might also be thinking about, what are some ways, if we want to drill into readability, what are, just straight up some hits that you could ask folks. I mean, I had some sample ones about that, but I mean, are there other things I'm not thinking about in terms of, particularly the human as legible thing, some ways to get at that in hits.
Yeah, that is sort of the next big. Yeah.
And as you pointed out, who do we talk to? That's another thing is, we don't have to do this in a vacuum, and we probably shouldn't.
No.
We already talked to Casey, who'd be but I bet you he might know some folks also, of course he does, that might be able to, I mean, if not give us practical advice about, oh, here's what you want in your hit, but here's what I'm thinking in terms of humans as legible, entities or whatever.
Yeah.
Who might we talk to who has something to say about this?
I think that's a good next step is I think thinking more about how we want to approach legibility and readability, so we can kind of refine that, which will help us then as we invite people on board, give them a sense of what we're up to. But those, I think, can happen simultaneously.
Yeah, making a note here.
So
Oh.
people that will help us think through this question of readability, right, in the way that Casey's Sense Commons project does. Right. But then also people who might also be able to provide some interesting methodological or method advice. And those might be related, right? Because it may be that part of our method are precisely the composition of these hits is our method, right? That's our apparatus. We want to somehow generate hits that Turkers will engage, pick up in ways that tell us something about readability.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's a way forward. And yeah, it's a shame I can't get the GPT-3 thing, but I mean, maybe we will at some point, or
yeah,
I don't know.
But
I was also kind of looking like, well, maybe there's a comparable one, because there's all kinds of text generating stuff, but right now this kind of seems like it's, if you're going to do it, this feels like the one to do, because it seems different and relevant. I mean, it seems by degree different from other ones, and it's certainly a relevant one right now.
Yeah, and hopefully, I mean, we get access to it, but otherwise it does at least give us something to think about in terms of what kinds of hits would we want it to have generated for us. Yeah. And that gives us, at least something to chew on for a little bit, right? Would it have been slightly tweaked or slightly off, right? Hits about readability, but hits that are also a struggle in terms of readability, which we may discover, right, that those are in large part the hits that we've already been engaging, which is hits that are themselves not legible enough to Turkers.
Yeah.
So, there's a kind of base legibility that's required for a hit to be taken up and completed.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're an hour and a quarter in. Anything else right now?
That's it. But no, I like that. I like that focus on readability, because it doesn't preclude the other things, but I think it gives us otherwise, right? Otherwise we're back to, so how do you feel about Turks, which is both already been done and not a particularly focused, right? That's not a good research question.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was kind of struggling with the sort of generality of that, and also my own sort of, fraud in being someone who, because a better ethnographer would know what to do there. It's like, oh, okay, well, here's how you go in and tease out what you want. Where it's like, we're sort of, often my students are sort of square zero about, well, what's your thoughts on this,
Right.
I think unpacking a term in different ways is something that is part of our training.
No, I think too, right. That's a sort of, I was about to say basic, but that sounded bad, right? I mean, that's a standard rhetorical move. How is this term operative? Yeah, no, we're going from, I've spent the last 31 episodes of this pretending to be someone in computational rhetoric, so now I'm going to spend the next 30 pretending to be someone that's in ethnography. I mean, that's, I don't know, such a Plato. I don't know why Plato gave us such a hard time.
Right. Ugh, yeah. If there's one thing I need right now, it's more imposter syndrome.
Yeah, no, that's good. We're just inviting it. Luckily, we're making that a part of the thing. So we've at least, right, at least if we've done anything, we've managed to, I think, as you and I are good at, we've managed to turn something we're very anxious about and turn it into at least something productive. Yeah. What if I I just publicly performed my anxiety. Ooh, well, now I've got an ISBN number. I mean, that's fantastic. This is really working out for me. So, okay, well, I'm gonna get back into the discussion section.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna get, I'll look into that digital ethnography book by Sarah Pink, and maybe even see if that's someone that we might want to, chat with, bring on.
Yeah, definitely.
So,
All right. And I'll start thinking about hits and also some of the other framework I'm at least passingly familiar with in terms of framing readability, maybe within the context of like literacy broadly understood.
yeah, and I think that would be interesting to develop that notion too. So how do we, and that might be sort of Pink's work on digital ethnography, but also sensory ethnography, right? That whole notion of, because that, I mean, we're kind of getting that notion of sensors and sensitivities. There's a kind of, that part of that notion of readability is comprehension, legibility, but there's also a kind of sensory component to it as well, right? Particularly with the legibility component, right? Literally the
Yeah.
human capacity to distinguish signal from noise and stuff like that. So,
Maybe, I mean, later, we maybe even talk to a disability studies person.
yes, yeah.
Because this is certainly something in their wheelhouse where you start talking about sense and meaning.
Yeah, no, that could be. And Casey and I have been doing we've done a couple collaborations in the vein of disability studies. So we did a thing on captioning, and we've done some stuff on accessibility. And so that might be some people there to bring in too, right? That, yeah. Because there is some, well, this was Jim's piece on epicresis, right? This idea of people in a network helping to, run and manage that network by,
Be my eyes, folks, and
yeah, and what they're doing, it's a kind of they're making particularly the quote tweet, right, is actually a certain kind of rendering hate speech legible to the community, right? That's itself a kind of reading practice that's both, comprehending it as hate speech, but also that the actual mechanism of quote tweeting is more about its legibility, right? Rendering people sensitive to it. So, yeah. And again, I can see then how this second piece will get us into those, those more
questions.
Yeah. So, okay. Well,
right.
Back to work.
Yep. I'll talk to you later.
Okay. Bye.
Yeah.